Well, after what I would call an extended delay, we finally reached the 2020 NHL Draft. So welcome to Scouching's final 2020 Draft Rankings special. Now usually my rankings are 111 players long with a watch list at the end of guys that I just want to keep an eye on, and because I think that 111 is won 3 times and I just find that funny. But this year I've had a bit of a change in philosophy recently where if there are players where I'm just not sure there's enough where they can make it to the NHL in really any way, I just flat out removed them from my rankings. And if after my viewings and tracking a bunch of data on these players, I'm still left with the mentality that there's really no scenario in which I'd push for that player at the draft table, I should probably remove them from my rankings. So we've slimmed things down a little bit, and just for the purposes of this video and for time, we're going to only be covering the top 6 tiers of my rankings. If you'd like to see the whole list, you can click the link below and go to my blog post on Scouching.ca, where there will be more information on this entire list of players. And one thing to note before we get into the show, most of the players I've already covered in Scouching reports won't be covered in this video, except for the guys at the very, very top. So if you want more in-depth looks at some of the players that might not be brought up in this video, you should definitely click the card here that will link you to the playlist for all 2020 Scouching reports. So with all that out of the way, let's get right down to the show. I'm gonna need to be pretty careful here, it seems. So to start things off, we go to the 6th tier of my rankings, which ranges from the 29th rank to the 45th. I'm a really strong believer in the fact that this year's second round could be full of very fascinating prospects that could lead to being steals. And one of the most divisive players of the draft this year has been Zion Nybeck from HV71 in Sweden. Now, I've seen this team play quite a few times, tracking Emil Andre, Nybeck himself, and Anton Johannesson, and I've seen Nybeck in his time in the SHL so far. And I will admit that there are areas of his game where I certainly think he is going to be a small player that struggles against better competition, especially in North America. But where Nybeck may lack something like an escape gear when he's under pressure, he does manage pressure from defenders very well. He adapts to play on the fly quite well, he takes care of the puck and makes solid passing plays all around the ice. I didn't find his 5v5 offense to be as apparent as you might hope from someone who scored as many points as he did, but he was a capable player in the offensive end with some flashes of interesting ability in the neutral zone to cut off defensive zone transitions. I'm still not 100% sold on the idea of him being a tremendously undervalued player, but he's shifty and he's skilled, and when he's playing well, he's a lot of fun to watch, so I'll at least be curious to see where he ends up on draft day and where his career goes in the near future. And while I have questions, I do think he manages his shortcomings pretty well, and there isn't a 0% chance that he becomes a solid NHL contributor. It'll just have to be in a scoring role because I don't really see anything short of that being possible for him. Sticking with Swedes, another player that I really liked this season was Emil Heineman from Leksands. This is a player who came out of nowhere. He's older for this year's draft class, but his production absolutely exploded this year, especially when you just look at his goal scoring. His two-way metrics, such as my catalyst percentages for him, were extremely promising, and whenever I watched him play, I came away thinking that this could be a guy that could plug in on an NHL roster pretty quickly as a bottom 6 energy winger, and potentially down the road something even more if his skill and his skating can really combine with that physicality to make himself a better power forward. He had some very strong moments around the net at the SHL level, but I did note that away from the puck in defensive transitions, his metrics in terms of shutting down those transitions were awful. They were among the worst I've tracked all year. But he's a straightforward, physical, straight-line player that can really separate pucks from opponents and make little plays around the net that can push pucks in. And I will forgive a bit of shortcomings at the SHL level for a player that really was kind of like a depth player at the under-20 level last year. So to go from a non-factor in the scope of the NHL draft a year ago to an SHL bottom 6 player to an SHL everyday player this year is a pretty big series of jumps for a young player, so I will want to keep an eye on him, but I do think that there's a smart and dependable two-way winger here that could plug in on any NHL roster. The third player I want to look at in this tier is Brandon Coe of the North Bay Battalion. Now, a lot of people seem to think that I don't like players that are big, but all I'm really looking for is players that, regardless of their size, show good results. If you're big, it's an asset, but it's not a must. Brandon Coe is a very good hockey player who just happens to be very big. Ooh. Just to get ahead of a potential problem, I'm gonna get rid of these. On the worst team in the Ontario Hockey League this year, in my tracking work, Brandon Coe was top 15 in a number of offensive categories. He was a top 25 offensive transition player, and with Brandon Coe on the ice, the North Bay Battalion sat 31st in my tracking in terms of dangerous shot attempts for. He's a big, skilled offensive winger who can simply embarrass opponents in the offensive zone. And he was in the top 30 in the vast majority of offensive categories that I track in all of my tracking work this year. And while there are some issues away from the puck and in the defensive zone, especially for a player that big, I certainly think that this is a very interesting profile to work with moving forward. And the last player in this tier is a player that I kind of want to put higher on my list, but I just can't bring myself to do it right now in Brendan Brisson. I see how good of a shot he has. I see how clever he is per puck touch with him on the ice. But I've tracked 6 games of his this year and he came very close to getting a full-length video. And his 5-on-5 results were at best to me hit or miss. He was second in producing dangerous shot attempts with him on the ice, but he was 89th when it comes to suppressing dangerous shots in his own end. His individual shot selection and rates of generating dangerous shot attempts off his own stick were frankly great. But in terms of preventing control and defensive transitions, Brisson sat 90th. And if I'm looking at centers, I want players who are at least capable of breaking up those transitions in the neutral zone, and Brendan Brisson was amongst the worst in all of my tracking at doing so. But will Brendan Brisson be an NHL player at some point? I certainly think so, especially if he switches over to the wing at some point, just based on the fact that his offensive awareness, offensive instincts, and raw shooting ability are extremely high level, and that should carry him a long way. But in terms of a 200-foot impact player that can be a #1 center, I don't think I see it right now. Maybe one day if he fills out his frame a little bit, puts a little bit more work in on defensive transitions, and cuts down on the lazy stick plays and hooks that he does in the neutral zone, there's potential to get there as an offensive center. But again, I'm not 100% sure that he's got that 200-foot impact right now, which prevents him from being higher on my list. The 5th tier of my ranking goes from the 19th ranked player to the 28th. One of the more miscast players to me in this entire draft is Jack Quinn. At least when I look at his 5-on-5 data, yes, he objectively has a very, very high level shot that he can let go from pretty much anywhere in the offensive zone. But my 5-on-5 data shows that 73% of his offensive threat metric came from his pass attempts. He is one of the very few players I've tracked this year that can hold a candle to Jean-Luc Foudy's rate of 22 dangerous pass attempts per 60 minutes. But I did find that with the passing decisions with Jack Quinn, there was less care relative to Jean-Luc Foudy. Foudy tended to really circle the offensive zone, waiting for the right chance to present itself, and completed a lot of those dangerous passes through the slot. Jack Quinn is more of an attack the boards kind of player who can just manage to get pucks squeaked out to the front of the net one way or the other. And a 66% pass completion percentage is forgivable considering how often he was putting pucks in front of the net. That's not necessarily a bad thing. One way or the other, pucks getting to the front of the net is objectively a good thing. But when I look at Jack Quinn skating around the ice, his defensive intensity level, his ability to shut down transitions as an aggressive winger along the boards in the neutral zone, and the fact that 55% of his shot attempts came from low danger areas and he was a pretty big volume shooter, leads me to believe that he might not be that top 15 or even top 10 player that some people have. I do think he could be a good scoring winger down the road, but in terms of a high impact two-way winger, I don't really think that he's worth that high of a draft pick. A complementary offensive piece for maybe a second line with some great power play upside, I can absolutely see that out of Jack Quinn, and that's what makes him a mid-first round pick to me. Next we go to arguably the biggest wild card of the entire draft in Hendrix Lapierre, and I really wanted to get as many looks at him as I possibly could, and if you told me that he was playing hurt in every single game this season that he did play, I would frankly just believe you without asking a question. Especially away from the puck, Hendrix Lapierre just looked downright bad. Inactive along the boards, inactive supporting teammates, not really active at all in defensive transitions as a center, and it just looked like someone who was dealing with some issues. His foot speed wasn't what I have seen of him in the past. His agility was certainly not what I thought it was in the past, but on the positive side, his offensive transition numbers and raw passing percentages were very positive. So as a transition player in offensive rushes, he is very reliable, but his offensive generation almost went to 0 this year. 78% of his shot attempts were from low danger, and while to me his redeeming qualities were before the injury issues, he looked like a fantastic NHL prospect, I can totally see a scenario where a legitimately talented player like him starts slipping because of what he showed this season. He's been good in the QMJHL preseason this year, but that's just QMJHL preseason, and he still remains a pretty big wild card to me. Next up is Ozzy Wiesblatt, and to me, I think Wiesblatt is one of the highest ceiling potential picks in this year's draft. He's a little bit wiry on his frame, but when he played center, I felt he showed tremendous potential at that position. He generates high danger shot attempts off his own stick at a rate beaten by only 3 players in my tracking this year. 50% of his shot attempts were from high danger areas, and with over 19 dangerous pass attempts per 60, he is one of the most ruthless dual-threat offensive weapons available in this year's draft. He is undersized and I think does need to put in more reps at the center position with his defensive engagement, where I did find that in certain games he was a step behind play a little bit too often and a little bit too weak on his feet, but I certainly believe that a player that can skate, pass, and shoot like Ozzy Wiesblatt can with the instincts that he has could become at best a ruthless offensive center or a very good complementary offensive scoring option for any team in the NHL. He was top 10 in dangerous shot generation off his own stick, top 30 in terms of suppressing defensive transitions with control, and while his offensive transition game might need work, his skating, his skill, his overall offensive intelligence and offensive output all lead me to believe that you're starting with a very strong fundamental case here for a player that you can really build on for the future. Up next, we're going to quickly go over Connor Zary. Over the course of this season, Zary is a player that I started souring on a little bit more and more. And that's not really because he's a bad hockey player, I just think that there's just not that much upside with Zary. I'm not exactly sure what he's going to be as an NHL player beyond a decent two-way center with maybe offensive winger upside if maybe it's not working out at the center position. I don't see a tremendous amount of improvement year over year from last year, and his results that I tracked at 5-on-5 were underwhelming at best, especially for a player that could be a top 15 pick. He's a smart forward who does have some nice tools that he can pull out of his toolbox when he needs to, but as an offensive center, coming away with 5-on-5 results that put him 76th in generating dangerous shot attempts with him on the ice, to me leaves a lot to be desired, especially for a WHL player who's not playing against men. But while his team wasn't generating a tremendous amount of dangerous chances, Zary was doing quite a lot off of his own stick. So with very good individual shot data, and I would say decent transition data in both directions, I think he has the tools and intelligence to become an NHL player, but I'm not necessarily looking directly at Zary for an overall high-impact 200-foot player here. I think he'll be a capable NHL player, but maybe not that top 6 offensive talent that his point production might indicate. The last thing I want to go over in this tier before moving on is why I have William Wallander ranked so high and a player like Caden Gooley or Braden Schneider ranked in my second round. And frankly, part of it comes down to when I see a player that I really like that generates results that I'm looking for, I become a bit of a riverboat gambler and will go to bat for that player until the cows come home. Wallander is just a player that I 100% believe in, even though there are clear deficiencies with his game. When you look at his size and his skating ability, he can be one of the most frustrating players in the defensive zone, but getting pucks back, making reads, taking care of the puck, and moving the puck up the ice with control is an extremely high-level trait that Wallander shows every single game that I watched him. He can be an absolute thrill to watch, carry pucks around the ice in all areas of the ice, push deep in the offensive zone, and can be a thrilling and exciting offensive defenseman when he's really playing well. He was the youngest player to play a long stretch in the Allsvenskan this year as a defenseman. At the under 20 level, he was a left-hand shot pasted to the right side more often than not. He's exceptionally mobile, daring with the puck. He's skilled and hasn't really filled out the 6'4" frame that he has, and he's also an extremely young player. So even if Wallander becomes an elite level puck rushing defenseman with some defensive shortcomings, I don't really see a problem with that, because he adds a ton of value in areas of the game that I am looking for. If positioning and using his frame physically is an issue for him, that sounds like things that can easily be sorted out in a video room over the next 4 years as he plays against men, which will expose whatever shortcomings he still has. And when looking at defensemen, I'd rather look for players with extremely high-end offensive instincts with measured success maintaining control of pucks moving them offensively, and try to raise the floor of their defensive talents to match that offensive talent a little bit better over the next few years, than start with a player where you have to do the opposite, where they rely on their defensive instincts first, generate good defensive results, but when play turns around offensively, things kind of fall apart and are just not nearly as good as their defense might indicate. Trying to develop vision, puck movement, adapting to heavy pressure in the defensive zone, trying to formulate a breakout, are things that to me can be quite difficult to learn on the fly as a high-end NHL draft pick, whereas defensive positioning, physical intensity, and just covering ice in the defensive zone is something that I think you can learn pretty easily. And when you have vision and skill and skating ability, at least in the offensive sense, improving play away from the puck allows the player to play much more often with the puck, which is where they are strongest. And let's take Braden Schneider for an example. I look at William Wallander and see a player who is 10 months younger, who already has experience playing against men, who has not gotten filled in playing against men, and will be playing significant time on ice in a men's league for the next couple of seasons before he makes the jump to North America. Braden Schneider will almost certainly be in the WHL for at least another one season, and then he has to jump straight into the AHL from there. And when I look at Schneider, there are some areas of his game that I think need to improve pretty quickly if he's going to project to being an AHL defenseman that quickly. So thinking about Wallander's potential development and long-term thinking on where his game could end up, that's a player that I would certainly think about in the first round. And when looking at guys like Schneider and Gooley, I have more questions about how far their game needs to go to become a full 200-foot impact player. And to me, I'd rather take the risk as a riverboat gambler on the really fun and exciting offensive defenseman and hope the defense comes a step than hope that a number of areas of the game for those more defensively sound players comes a few steps to reach the NHL success they could get to. Next we go to Tier 4, which encapsulates players from the 12th to 18th slots on my rankings. The first guy we're going to look at quickly is Maverick Bourque, and put simply, he is one of the smartest, most adaptable and creative playmakers available in this year's draft. Away from the puck, I'd say he's fine, but his offensive ability, his transition game, and his adaptability and playmaking vision with the puck on his own stick kind of overshadows those defensive shortcomings more than enough. He's a top 20 player when it comes to generating dangerous chances off of his own stick. His controlled offensive zone transition percentage and number of transitions across the offensive blue line are also near the top in my tracking. And he's much closer to the very top of my tracking when it comes to total offensive zone transitions, pass attempts, dangerous pass attempts, and overall offensive threat. So this might be one of the best offensive centers available in this year's draft, especially outside of the top 10. To me, he's a great pickup somewhere in the teens of this year's draft if you're looking for fun, exciting, offensive-leaning centers. And if he's available anywhere after 20th overall, he's a guy that I'm really pushing hard to take a swing on. The second player in this tier we're going to look at is Dawson Mercer, and I found Dawson Mercer frustrating. But frustrating in the same way I found a player like Jan Mysak frustrating. You see the talent, you see the ability, you know what these players are capable of, but you just don't see it enough to consider the player a real high-end prospect. Mercer has some of the best hands in tight and some of the best finishing ability in medium danger areas that I've tracked this season. He had very good results in offensive transitions as well, but I tracked 0 high danger attempts off of his own stick, which for a scoring winger you'd kind of expect to see more of. There was also some of the lowest involvement in defensive transitions that I tracked out of anyone, and it leads me to believe that Dawson Mercer might be a guy more suited to the wing position rather than center down the road, which is perfectly fine. But he had the 88th worst pass completion percentage, he was 82nd in dangerous shot attempts against, and there was an overall feeling of inconsistency that just rattled my cage a little bit. I think he has some exceptional talent, and if you really just want to bet on his talent, he could be a guy taken in the 10 to 15 slot of this year's draft, no problem. But I look at players like Noel Gunler, Jan Mysak, and now Dawson Mercer and see some inconsistencies game through game and some issues away from the puck that really concern me to the point where I might not touch a player like Mercer until the mid-teens, but he is undeniably a good talent available this year. Now we're getting into the fun stuff. We're going to go straight into the third tier from here and look at Rodion Amirov one more time. I just really like him, and that much is clear. His offensive transition game is excellent. He has a good ability to get into dangerous areas at the KHL level to get dangerous shot attempts for himself. He drove great results at the junior level and 2 men's leagues levels, and in a system that focuses on puck protection and possession and caring for the puck in offensive transitions, Amirov could be a great add for whatever team fits that system. There's great two-way instincts, his agility, his skill, and his puck possession ability are all very high level, playing in the second best professional league in the world, and if his puck control can take another step, if his confidence with the puck can take another step, and he adds some more strength on his frame to go along with that shiftiness on his feet, he could be a tremendous 200-foot player with great offensive ability. And I have him ranked really high. If you draft him and give him a couple more years to develop in Russia, I think you could end up with a great overall impact winger here, regardless of what team picks him. Now we're going to do something a little different and look at the goalie. Yes, that goalie. Yaroslav Askarov. Now, I'm not an expert in goaltending, and recently I've been deferring things more to Catherine Silverman on Twitter, and if you don't follow her already, you probably should. But frankly, I look at Yaroslav Askarov and just see a really good goalie. He is good. He always has been good. Except for that World Junior Tournament, he's been great. He plays for a program that is the biggest hockey program in Russia. He's a full-time member of their KHL team, and he seems to be handling the pressure of that scenario pretty well. And if there's anyone on the planet who likes to not play young players, it is Russian hockey coaches. And the big question to me is, if you know for a fact that you have a 50-50 chance at landing a franchise goaltender who can be on your team for the next 10 years, where in the draft do you make that bet? Do you make that bet at 5th overall, 7th overall, 10th overall, 20th overall? Honestly, when you look at value in the NHL draft and you have an individual case study like Askarov, that is a bet that I think you can start to think about making pretty early. The value of players in the NHL draft drops off pretty quickly, especially after the first 10 or 15 picks. So I look at Askarov with what he's doing on the ice and the track record that he's had over the last few years and say, that's a guy I probably want to bet on instead of looking for another offensive complementary winger, especially if I have a lot of those in my pipeline already. He makes the game just look easy. He's tremendously athletic. In very difficult scenarios, he remains in control, and I think if he starts slipping a little bit, he could be a great pickup. And getting a franchise #1 goaltender is something that can literally save the job of a coach and general manager. So yes, there's risk with goaltenders in the first round, but when I look at Askarov and his track record and what I've seen of him in person, I'm not super concerned about his trajectory. In this tier, you might also notice that Jamie Drysdale is here and Jake Sanderson is not. I think there is an argument to be made that Sanderson deserved a spot in this tier, but personally, I just don't think he's quite on the same level as a Jamie Drysdale is. I think Drysdale does things that are quite difficult, like back foot passes into the neutral zone from the defensive zone, anticipating offensive rushes to chip in offensively, and just the overall mobility with Drysdale seems to be a bit of a step ahead of where Sanderson is right now. But Sanderson's rushing ability and his ability to manipulate opposing defenses with the puck on his own stick is really interesting and something that I'm really curious to watch develop over the next few years. He's got great two-way metrics, but didn't play nearly as many 5-on-5 minutes as Drysdale did. And while I think Sanderson might be more of an impactful 200-foot player that might not put up as many points as Jamie Drysdale, and Jamie Drysdale might be more of that offensive power play quarterback defenseman that teams are looking for now, I do think that those two players are relatively comparable, and I'm all ears if someone at the draft table wants to put Jake Sanderson ahead of Drysdale. I personally wouldn't do it, but I think there's data to back it up, and Sanderson shows things, especially on the defensive side of the puck, that I think Drysdale does not, at least not right now. Now we go to tier 2, and you'll notice that Marco Rossi is the #1 player in this tier for me. Almost every single shift, I saw Marco Rossi doing something that was productive. He's an absolute horse, almost all the time. Yeah, sometimes in defensive transitions, he could leave a little bit to be desired, and you wish he would keep his feet moving a little bit, but he anticipates play extremely well and picks his spots to get involved physically very, very well to turn play around. And once play turns around, he becomes a tremendous transition player with great offensive ability. His ability to carry pucks into and through the neutral zone was simply stunning. He has an excellent pass completion percentage, he takes care of the puck very well, he's tremendously intelligent with how he uses his skill and his talent, and when push comes to shove, he's a tremendous playmaker that plays with a lot of purpose. And to me, I'm gonna settle this in my own head once and for all. Marco Rossi is a center. From my viewings, when he plays the wing, he's just not nearly as effective. To me, for him, it's center or bust, and I don't really think he's at risk of being a bust. He has the reputation of being someone who will stop at nothing until they maximize the talent they're capable of. And I think Marco Rossi has a tremendous fundamental base layer to work on, and if his skating can take a step in the NHL, I think he could be a tremendous two-way impact player with great offensive ability. And this was something that I came across in prepping for this video. He was 34th and 29th respectively in total offensive and defensive zone transitions, which doesn't necessarily sound like a tremendous amount, but when you look at all of his transitions that But when you look at all of his total transitions going in all of my tracking, he was 6th in the percentage of those transitions that were controlled and in the offensive direction. So of every 10 transitions that Marco Rossi was involved in offensively or defensively, 5.7 of them were controlled offensive transitions moving towards the opponent's net. That to me is pretty wild, and that is an indicator to me that he is the player that is driving the bus for one of the most dominant lines in junior hockey this year. Another player I wanted to go over here again was Cole Perfetti. I'm not necessarily sold as Cole Perfetti being an impact center in the NHL, but I do think he could be a great first-line offensive winger if that center game doesn't work out in the NHL. There's tremendous intelligence and skill, and he can manipulate opponents very, very well all over the ice to open up passing and shooting lanes, especially in the offensive end. He's the only other player that I tracked this year that could keep up with Marco Rossi's overall transition data, but I found he generated a lot more of those transitions through his passing, which is perfectly fine. It's just kind of two sides of the same coin. But in a similar way to Brendan Brisson, he was the #1 player in my tracking in terms of generating dangerous chances as a team with him on the ice, but was 88th in the same metric in the defensive end, which leads me to be a bit questioning of his defensive abilities as a center, but really gives me promise for his play as an offensive player down the road. This year, of all the players I tracked, Perfetti was just the epitome of cowboy hockey. High-end offense and just not a whole lot of defense, at least not on paper. So I think he could be a great offensive weapon, but I just don't necessarily see him quite on the same level as my top 5 this year. The last guy in this tier that I want to go over is Lucas Raymond. Now, a lot of people are saying that Europeans that are already playing hockey as of today should probably not have these games taken into consideration when looking at their draft potential in this year's NHL draft. And I mostly agree with that. But my counter to that is, have you seen Lucas Raymond playing hockey for Frölunda this year? He just is an outstanding hockey player. I really don't know how else to put it. I don't really think it's quite enough for me to put Raymond as my #3 player, but if you wanted to convince me that Raymond was the guy at #3 for the Ottawa Senators, I will listen to that argument all day. I just absolutely love watching Lucas Raymond play hockey. He anticipates play away from the puck extremely well. He's one of the most explosive players on his feet in the entire draft. He had 19% of his passes registered as dangerous attempts in a men's league in limited usage, and I think the offensive potential is only beginning to be tapped with Lucas Raymond. And he already shows all of these little things and great defensive results that coaches are looking for, especially from high-octane offensive talent. In terms of dangerous shot percentage, he's the #2 player in all my tracking, and he played in the SHL. And he had the lowest number of dangerous shot attempts against with him on the ice. He may have been underutilized in the SHL, but he drove excellent defense-first results with signs of offensive potential that I think are just waiting to be unlocked. And the more I see him, the more I think that there's potential for him to be a center down the road. He's got the mobility, he has the intelligence, he puts in work in all areas of the ice, and he's willing to use teammates often in his passing work, but he can also carry the puck with skill and speed very well. But even as a top-end first-line winger that just makes life easy for everyone he plays with, Raymond is a guy that I just cannot see falling out of the top 5, but there seems to be a chance that he will. So if you're a team in the back half of the top 10 and Lucas Raymond is still on the board, that's the guy I'm pushing for. It's pretty obvious, and you should probably go find some tape of him playing this year if you can. The final tier only contains the top 2 prospects on my list, Alexis Lafreniere and Quinton Byfield. And you can nitpick and pick apart Quinton Byfield's game all you want, but I really don't care. That kid has so much potential. He is so good when he's playing well. There are moments where you wish he would put in a bit more effort, sure. But in my opinion, you can say the exact same thing about Alexis Lafreniere. But it really, to me, comes down to betting on potential versus betting on what's just right in front of you. Alexis Lafreniere, as of today, is objectively the better player than Quinton Byfield. But when you look at Byfield's frame, his physical ability, his skating ability, and his skill with his hands, there is an absolutely nasty package of skills there that you can work on with Byfield. I think Lafreniere fits what the Rangers look for in hockey players to a T, and I think that's a no-brainer pick. But if it was another team at the first overall selection, I think there's a perfectly reasonable discussion to be had on which team would go first. Someone like the Detroit Red Wings could afford to bring Byfield along at a little bit of a slower pace, to work through the shortcomings that he does have from time to time, and just turn him into the best potential player he can be. Whereas I feel like the Rangers are kind of starting a win-now era with Panarin and Zibanejad getting a little bit older, and 2 very young goaltenders with some excellent defense prospects and defensemen already on the team that should drive really good results quickly. Lafreniere is a gifted offensive player who's able to use his skill effectively to just generate production. He's a machine at doing it, at least at the Quebec League level. But Byfield is a completely unique package of skill, playmaking vision, skating ability, and size, where if things go right, teams will always wish they had a player like Quinton Byfield on their team. And I think the only mistake you can make is trying to turn Byfield into a two-way, big, physical center, trying to limit his offensive creativity and offensive ability, and working a little bit too much on just moving his feet in the defensive zone. It's something that might need a little bit of work, but he still generated pretty tremendous offensive transition results, and his offensive potential in this year's draft, when you look at everything combined, I think is arguably at the highest level of anyone in this year's draft. So some overall thoughts on this year's draft with a few awards that I want to hand out to close off this season of Scouching reports. I think this year's draft is going to be fascinating. Last year's top 20 was absolutely jammed with surprises, and I think this year is going to be no different. I also feel that this year's draft through the second round might be a little bit deeper in really interesting project picks that could be interesting steals down the road. And I think that there are some really undervalued players that could be available much later in the draft than they should be, especially when you look at the players that might be a little bit undersized. And while it's the end of September, I am still having a tremendous amount of fun watching all of these players. I think it's a great draft class full of really, really fun players and some interesting personalities to go along with it. So to close out the year, we're going to do the first annual Scouching Awards, and to hand out the awards, I need my anointing stick. Somebody hand me my anointing stick. All right, I'll just hand it to myself. This is my anointing stick, and with it, I have 3 awards that I would like to hand out to 3 prospects that I think stood out for varying reasons. So to start, we're going to go to the Mr. Overrated Award. Now, I want to be clear. By saying overrated, I do not mean that this is a bad hockey player. I just mean that the player, relative to expectations by some people out there, especially in the online scouting sphere, really might think a little bit too much of, but I still think that this player does hold some value. You're just going to need to be a little bit more patient than I think you might think with him. And if he ever sees this video, I guess this is an invitation to prove me wrong, because it would be really nice if he did. And the first ever Mr. Overrated reward is represented by this polka-dotted lion thing, because this animal would be absolutely useless in the animal kingdom. I mean, just look at this thing. It's a cute baby lion, but it has rainbow camouflage with black spots on it. You can see this thing from a mile away. It's not gonna hunt anything successfully, but it looks cute and it might be a lot of fun. So the first ever Mr. Overrated award goes to Mr. Jan Mysak of the Hamilton Bulldogs. Again, please don't get me wrong. I really like Jan Mysak. He's a lot of fun. And he did improve over the time that I tracked him playing with Hamilton, but I just can't seem to hitch my wagon to the Mysak as a top talent in this year's draft train. He's a fun skater, he could be an exciting center, but I see far too little in his overall involvement as a 200-foot player, and far too little offensive involvement far too often to lead me to believe that he's a top-end talent in the draft. If he's available in the second round though, that's an easy call. He's got strong fundamentals to work on, and I think part of his issues were translating to the North American game. But I can't help but watch him in the OHL and just come away wanting more out of him, especially as a 5-on-5 player. Great power play player already, but I personally don't value that a tremendous amount. Most of the game is at 5-on-5, and as an offensive center, I just didn't see a whole lot out of Mysak. The next award I want to hand out goes to Mr. Analytics, and this award is going to be represented by a rainbow owl with a horn on his head. Look at this thing. You wouldn't be able to see this thing coming from a mile away because it's circling well above your head. It also can dive bomb at over 100 miles an hour from what I remember reading Microsoft Encarta in 1997. So you take an owl with the dive bomb capability that it has and put a horn on his head, and you might have the most dangerous and ruthless animal in the animal kingdom without really considering what you're looking at. But I mean, this thing is just built around efficiency. And this year's recipient of Mr. Analytics is Brett Berard of the USA National Development Program. This is pretty rudimentary, but on average, across every statistical category I track, Brett Berard was the highest ranked player on average. And it was by quite a wide margin, and the standard deviation was also pretty small with him. He's the #1 player that I tracked when it comes to generating offensive transitions. He's a great all-around offensive threat with good passing numbers and great shooting numbers. His defensive controlled zone transition percentage was 28. His offensive controlled zone transition percentage put him 7th. And if he's a guy you can land in the second round, I think you absolutely should do it. I do have reservations about putting Berard in my first round, but this is a guy that has been ranked in the late second, potentially third round. And with the value that he produces on an analytical basis, I think that's a great pickup in the second round, let alone the third. He may be small, he may play a little bit small, but he is one of the youngest players available in this year's draft. He adapts to pressure better than most players I've tracked this year to generate a lot of those offensive transitions, and he pushes play up the ice with control of the puck better than a lot of the players that I've tracked that might be going higher than him in this year's draft. The final award that I'm going to hand out is the Mr. Stick Your Neck Out Award, and this is pretty fitting with all things being considered and how far we've come in this season. The award is represented by what I stupidly thought was a giraffe in the store, but in reality it is a llama. Llamas still have long necks, so it still counts. But the Mr. Stick Your Neck Out Award is just going to the one player that I loved watching so much this season and believe in so much that I have them ranked absurdly high, and frankly, I don't really care. If I'm wrong, it's a great case study to look back on as to why I was wrong. But if I'm right, I will pat myself on the back so hard that my hand comes out the other side. And if you've been paying attention for the whole season, this should be obvious, but the Mr. Stick Your Neck Out Award goes to Marat Kuznetsov of SKA St. Petersburg. I might be overvaluing him. I'll admit it. But I just can't help myself. He is one of the most fun players and admirable players to watch play the game that I've seen all year this year. I absolutely love watching him play hockey. He is the ideal version of what I am looking for in an NHL level center if his game works out. A full 200-foot game. Intensity and quickness all over the ice, constantly involved in transitions both offensive and defensive. Positional support of defenders on board play. Positional support of players on breakouts, able to generate speed and selflessly find line mates in transition, and skill, creativity, and aggressiveness in the offensive zone that are there in flashes that I really think could be unlocked more and more as he fills out his frame and gets more confident against better competition. He was 19th in my tracking in dangerous shot attempt percentage, 4th in dangerous shot attempts against per 60. He was 8th in offensive controlled zone transition percentage. He was tremendously active away from the puck on defensive transitions. And while getting stronger on his feet will be paramount to future success for Kuznetsov, he is a natural center who I think shows all of the instincts, work ethic, raw talent, and skill that I think he'll need to become a great center down the road. He hasn't looked horribly out of place in the limited KHL minutes that I've seen him play this season, and while it may take a few years for him to capture what he's capable of, I'm willing to give him all the time he needs to figure it out, because I think he can get there. So with that, we're done. The 2020 Scouching season has now drawn to a close, and the only thing between now and the 2020 Draft Recap Series is the NHL Draft. So please, if you haven't already, click the links below and in the card next to me to set your reminders for the Scouching Draftathon for 2020. It'll start half an hour before the draft Tuesday night and a half hour before the draft Wednesday morning, and we're going to be streaming throughout the entire show. Any money raised will be matched up to $1,000 and donated to the You Can Play project. So with that, thank you very much for watching. It has been a pleasure to bring you these reports over the course of this season, and we will most definitely be back next season. If you liked the video, click all the buttons you see below me so you never miss another one. If you really liked it, you could subscribe on Patreon or here on YouTube by clicking join below. You'll get access to early access to videos, a Discord server, data sheets for hundreds of drafted and undrafted prospects, as well as plenty of other goodies, or you could pick up some merchandise from the Scouchwear shop, where 50% of all profits go to the Women's Sports Foundation. So that's all. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you at the Draftathon, and stay tuned for the draft recaps immediately after the draft is completed next week.